In a small, peaceful town surrounded by rolling hills and lush green fields, an elderly man named Harold Hal Thompson lived a simple yet meaningful life. Hal wasn't just any ordinary senior citizen. He was a living legend in his own right. Years ago, he had been part of the Old Guard, the prestigious ceremonial unit of the U.S. Army known for its precision, discipline, and unwavering dedication. These soldiers were often seen standing tall at national monuments or solemnly escorting fallen heroes to their final resting place at Arlington National Cemetery. But now, Hal spent most of his days tending to his modest garden, where rows of vibrant flowers and vegetables thrived under his care. Despite his calm routine, Hal's mind frequently wandered back to his younger days when he wore the iconic blue uniform with shiny brass buttons. Those years had been filled with pride, sacrifice, and unforgettable moments that shaped him into the man he was today. He remembered the crisp mornings, the sound of boots clicking against pavement, and the rhythmic hoofbeats of horses as they marched together in perfect harmony. Each memory felt like a cherished treasure stored deep within his heart. One sunny afternoon, as Hal sat on his porch sipping lemonade, the mailman arrived with a bundle of letters. Among them was an envelope that caught his eye immediately. It bore the insignia of the local equestrian club, a group Hal had heard about but never interacted with. Curious, he opened it carefully and pulled out a neatly typed letter. To his surprise, it was an invitation addressed specifically to him. The equestrian club was hosting its annual horse show, and they wanted Hal to attend, not just as a spectator, but as their guest of honor. At first, Hal hesitated. He hadn't attended such events in years, and the thought of being in the spotlight made him uneasy. What could he possibly offer these people? He was just an old man with faded memories of a lifelong past. But something about the letter tugged at his heartstrings. Maybe it was the sincerity in the words or the fact that someone still cared enough to recognize his contributions. After much deliberation, Hal decided to accept the invitation. Deep down, he hoped this might be an opportunity to reconnect with a piece of his past. Over the next few days, Hal prepared for the event with quiet determination. He dusted off his old uniform jacket, which still fit surprisingly well despite the passage of time. He polished the brass buttons until they gleamed like gold and carefully arranged his medals so they hung perfectly straight. Then, he retrieved a worn photo album from the attic, a collection of snapshots capturing some of the most defining moments of his career. There were pictures of him standing beside towering marble monuments, marching in parades and riding majestic horses during somber ceremonies. One photograph stood out among the rest. Hal atop a striking black horse named Thunder, whose intelligent eyes seemed to pierce through the camera lens. Thunder had been more than just a mount. He was a trusted companion who carried Hal through countless missions without faltering once. As the day of the horse show approached, Hal couldn't shake off a mix of excitement and nervousness. Would anyone truly understand what the Old Guard meant to him? Could they grasp the depth of the bond between soldier and horse? These questions lingered in his mind, but Hal chose to focus on the positive. Perhaps this event would allow him to share his story, pass along lessons learned, and remind others of the values that defined his service: honor, respect, and loyalty. Little did he know, the horse show would become far more than just a trip down memory lane. It would be a day that reignited old passions, forged new connections, and left an indelible mark on everyone involved. The morning of the horse show dawned bright and clear, with the sun casting golden rays over the quiet countryside. Hal woke up earlier than usual, his heart racing with a mix of anticipation and nostalgia. He carefully dressed in his old uniform jacket, which still carried the faint scent of polish and history. Each button gleamed under the soft light as he fastened them one by one, his fingers moving slowly but deliberately. On his chest, medals hung proudly, each one telling a story of sacrifice, duty, and honor. But it wasn't just the uniform that made this day special. It was the memories it brought back. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his cap, Hal couldn't help but feel transported to another time, when he was younger, stronger, and part of something much bigger than himself. Before leaving, Hal picked up the weathered photo album he had retrieved from the attic days earlier. Its pages were filled with black and white photographs, some faded with age, but still vivid in meaning. He flipped through them slowly, pausing at certain images that stirred deep emotions. There was one of him standing at attention beside the tomb of the unknown soldier, his posture rigid, his expression solemn. Another showed him marching in a grand parade, surrounded by fellow soldiers whose faces were etched with pride. But the picture that always drew him in the most was the one of Thunder, the magnificent black horse who had been his partner for years. In the photo, Hal sat tall in the saddle, his hand resting gently on Thunder's neck. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert and focused, as if ready to carry his rider into whatever lay ahead. Hal smiled softly, remembering how Thunder had never let him down, not during slippery descents down Arlington's steep hills, or in the pouring rain when visibility was nearly zero. They had been a team, bound together by trust and mutual respect. As Hal drove toward the venue, his mind continued to wander. He thought about the countless hours he had spent training with Thunder, learning not only how to ride, but also how to communicate without words. Horses like Thunder weren't just animals. They were extensions of the soldiers themselves, embodying grace, strength, and dignity. Hal recalled how every movement, every step, had been executed with precision because lives depended on it. Whether it was guiding a caisson carrying a fallen hero or leading a procession during a state funeral, there was no room for error. It was this level of commitment that set the old guard apart, and Hal had been proud to be part of it. When he arrived at the horse show grounds, Hal parked his car and stepped out cautiously, gripping his cane for support. The scene before him was bustling with activity. Rows of stalls lined the area, each housing horses of various breeds and colors. Riders moved about, brushing their mounts' coats until they shone, adjusting saddles, and practicing last-minute commands. The air buzzed with excitement, punctuated by the occasional whinny or clatter of hooves against the ground. Despite the lively atmosphere, there was an underlying sense of reverence, almost as if everyone knew something significant was about to happen. Hal began walking slowly toward the main arena, his eyes scanning the crowd. What struck him most was the way people stopped what they were doing to look at him. Young riders paused mid-brushstroke, their mouths slightly agape as they watched him approach. Parents nudged their children, whispering explanations about who he was and why he mattered. Even seasoned trainers tipped their hats in respect. For a moment, Hal felt self-conscious, unsure if he deserved all the attention. But then he reminded himself of the weight of the uniform he wore and the legacy it represented. This wasn't just about him. It was about honoring the traditions and values upheld by generations of soldiers before him. As Hal reached the entrance of the arena, an announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Harold Thompson, a true hero of the old guard." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the open field. Hal felt a lump rise in his throat as he raised a hand in acknowledgement, his heart swelling with gratitude. Though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a day that would leave an indelible mark on both him and everyone present. The applause that greeted Hal as he entered the arena was unlike anything he had experienced in years. It wasn't the polite clapping of a formal gathering or the distant admiration of strangers. It was heartfelt, genuine, and overwhelming. Hal felt every pair of eyes on him as he made his way to the front of the crowd, leaning slightly on his cane but holding his head high. His uniform jacket, adorned with medals and polished brass buttons, seemed to catch the sunlight, drawing even more attention. Children craned their necks to get a better look, while adults whispered among themselves, sharing stories they'd heard about the old guard. For a man who had spent decades blending into the background of civilian life, this sudden spotlight was both humbling and surreal. When Hal finally reached the designated seating area near the main stage, he was met by the event organizers, who greeted him warmly. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, stepped forward and shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "We can't thank you enough for being here today. Your presence means so much to all of us." Hal nodded graciously, though he still felt a bit out of place. He wasn't used to being celebrated. During his time in the Old Guard, recognition had been rare. Soldiers were taught to serve quietly, without seeking praise. But now, surrounded by smiling faces and waves of gratitude, Hal couldn't deny the warmth spreading through his chest. Before long, it was time for the ceremony to begin. The organizers had arranged for Hal to deliver a speech before the horse show competition started, a request that initially made him nervous. Public speaking wasn't something he did often these days, but he understood its importance. As he climbed the steps to the podium, the crowd fell silent, their eyes fixed on him with anticipation. Hal adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "I want to start by thanking you all for inviting me here today. It's an honor to be among such talented riders and beautiful horses." He paused, glancing at the rows of eager faces before continuing. "Many of you may not know what it means to be part of the Old Guard. To some, it might sound like just another unit within the military. But let me tell you, it's so much more than that." Hall went on to share stories from his time in service, painting vivid pictures of the discipline, camaraderie, and unwavering dedication required to uphold the standards of the Old Guard. He spoke of early mornings spent training, of standing guard in freezing temperatures, and of participating in ceremonies that demanded absolute perfection. But the highlight of his speech came when he mentioned Thunder, the black stallion who had been his loyal companion for years. Thunder wasn't just a horse, Hal explained, his voice softening. "He was my partner, my friend, and sometimes my savior. Together, we carried out duties that required trust, not just between rider and horse, but between soldier and nation." The audience listened intently, captivated by Hal's words. Some people leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every sentence, while others wiped away tears. Parents held their children closer, using the moment to teach them about respect and sacrifice. When Hal finished speaking, the applause returned, louder and more enthusiastic than before. Several riders stood up to cheer, their hands raised high in tribute. Hal bowed his head briefly, overwhelmed by the response. He hadn't expected his stories to resonate so deeply, but seeing the impact they had on the crowd filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. After stepping down from the podium, Hal was approached by a young girl no older than 10. She held out a small bouquet of wildflowers and shyly said, "Thank you for your service, Mr. Thompson." Hal knelt down to her level, accepting the gift with a smile. "You're very welcome, sweetheart," he replied. "And thank you for remembering." Moments like this reminded him why he had agreed to come, to ensure that the legacy of the Old Guard lived on, inspiring future generations to value honor, loyalty, and teamwork. As the ceremony transitioned into the first round of competitions, Hal settled into his seat, watching the riders take their positions. Each movement, each command, brought back memories of his own days in the saddle. Though he knew he could never fully relive those moments, he felt a renewed connection to the world he had once known, and to the people who now carried its spirit forward. After Hal's heartfelt speech, the energy in the arena shifted. The crowd was no longer just a gathering of spectators. They had become participants in something far greater, a celebration of tradition, respect, and the unbreakable bond between humans and horses. The organizers wasted no time transitioning into the next part of the ceremony, a grand parade of horses meant to honor not only the competitors, but also the history that Hall represented. The announcer's voice echoed across the field once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the parade of honor." With those words, the gates at one end of the arena swung open, revealing a line of riders mounted on majestic horses. Each horse was impeccably groomed, its coat gleaming under the sunlight, mane braided neatly, and tack polished to perfection. But what truly set this procession apart were the flags carried by the riders. flags representing every branch of the U.S. military. The stars and stripes led the way, held high by a rider seated atop a stunning white stallion. Behind it came the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and even a flag honoring veterans. It was a breathtaking sight, one that brought many in the audience to their feet. As the parade moved forward, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves filled the air, blending with the soft rustle of fabric as flags fluttered gently in the breeze. Hall stood near the edge of the arena, his hand raised in a crisp salute, his posture as straight as it had been during his service days. His eyes followed each horse and rider, pride swelling in his chest. These weren't just ordinary equestrians. They were carrying symbols of sacrifice, courage, and unity. Every step they took seemed to echo the footsteps of countless soldiers who had come before them, including Hal himself. When the procession reached the center of the arena, something extraordinary happened. One of the riders, a young woman named Emily, dressed in formal riding attire, dismounted gracefully and approached Hall. Her horse, a tall bay gelding, stood patiently beside her as she walked toward him. The crowd watched in silence, unsure of what was about to unfold. Emily stopped a few feet away from Hall and gave him a respectful nod. Then, without saying a word, she extended the reins of her horse toward him. Hal froze, momentarily stunned. He looked at the reins, then at Emily, whose expression radiated nothing but sincerity and admiration. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he should accept such a gesture. After all, it had been decades since he'd last ridden a horse. But something in Emily's eyes told him this wasn't just an offer, it was a tribute. Slowly, deliberately, Hal reached out and took the reins. The leather felt familiar in his hands, bringing back memories of thunder and the countless hours they had spent together. The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly as Hal patted the horse's neck gently. The bay gelding, sensing the significance of the moment, stood still and calm, as though understanding the weight of what was happening. Hal leaned closer to the horse, whispering softly, "You're a fine-looking fellow, aren't you?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. This moment wasn't just about him. It was about honoring the legacy of the old guard, the sacrifices of veterans, and the timeless partnership between human and horse. Emily remained by Hal's side, her own eyes shining with tears. "Thank you for everything you've done, Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "We wouldn't be here today without people like you." Hal nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart and gave her a small, grateful smile. As the parade continued around the arena, Hal stayed where he was, holding the reins of the bay gelding. People in the audience began snapping photos and recording videos, capturing the poignant scene. Parents pointed to Hal and explained to their children why this moment mattered. Riders tipped their hats in respect as they passed by, acknowledging the man who embodied the values they aspired to uphold. For Hal, this was more than just a ceremonial act. It was validation. It was proof that the lessons he had learned and the sacrifices he had made hadn't been forgotten. As he stood there, surrounded by the rhythmic sound of hooves and the fluttering of flags, he felt a profound sense of belonging. Though the years had passed and his role had changed, he realized that his story, and the stories of all those who served, still resonated deeply with others. And in that moment, Hal knew he wasn't alone. He was part of something eternal, a chain of honor and respect that stretched across generations. The moment when Hal accepted the reins of Emily's bay gelding marked a turning point in the day, one that no one present would soon forget. The organizers, recognizing the significance of what had just transpired, decided to take things a step further. They approached Hal with an idea so bold and unexpected that it left him momentarily speechless. They asked if he would be willing to ride alongside the parade. At first, Hal hesitated, his mind racing with doubts. Could he still do it? Would the horse respond to him as thunder once had? And more importantly, Could he handle the weight of being back in the saddle after all these years? But then he looked around at the sea of faces, children wide-eyed with wonder, parents nodding encouragingly, riders waiting patiently for his answer, and something inside him clicked. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about honoring the legacy he represented. With a deep breath, Hal agreed. The crowd erupted into cheers once again, their excitement palpable as volunteers helped him mount the bay gelding. Though his movements were slower now, there was still a grace to the way he settled into the saddle, his posture straight and proud, just as it had been decades ago. As the parade began its second lap around the arena, Hal found himself riding alongside the other participants, each carrying flags that fluttered like waves of color against the clear blue sky. The rhythmic sound of hooves striking the ground brought back memories so vivid it felt as though time itself had folded in on him. He could almost hear Thunder's steady breathing beside him, feel the familiar sway of the saddle beneath him, and sense the unspoken communication between rider and horse. For those few minutes, Hal wasn't an elderly man revisiting his past. He was a soldier once again, riding with purpose and pride. The audience watched in awe as Hal guided the bay gelding with surprising ease. His hands moved gently but firmly on the reins, his body swaying naturally with the horse's gait. It was clear that the skills he had honed during his years in the old guard hadn't faded completely. Young riders stole glances at him, marveling at how effortlessly he commanded respect, not through words or gestures, but simply by existing in harmony with the animal beneath him. Parents whispered to their children, "Look at him. That's what dedication looks like." For Hal, the experience was both exhilarating and emotional. Each step the horse took stirred memories he thought he'd locked away forever. He remembered the cold mornings at Arlington Cemetery, where frost clung to the grass and every movement required precision. He recalled the solemn processions where silence spoke louder than any words ever could. And he thought of Thunder, who had always been by his side, carrying him through challenges both physical and emotional. Riding now, Hal felt a connection not only to the bay gelding beneath him, but also to every soldier and horse who had walked this path before him. When the lap came to an end, Hal dismounted slowly, his legs stiff, but his spirit soaring. Volunteers rushed to assist him, but he waved them off with a smile, determined to stand on his own 2 feet. As he handed the reins back to Emily, he patted the horse's neck one last time, whispering, "You did good, boy. Real good." Emily beamed, her eyes shining with admiration. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," she said softly. This meant everything to us. The crowd broke into applause yet again, their cheers echoing across the open field. People stood clapping, some wiping away tears, others shouting words of gratitude. Hal raised a hand in acknowledgement, his heart full. He had come to the horse show expecting little more than a quiet afternoon among strangers, but instead he had become the centerpiece of an unforgettable tribute. As he stepped away from the arena and returned to his seat, Hal couldn't help but reflect on the power of shared experiences. Today wasn't just about honoring him. It was about bridging generations, connecting the past with the present, and reminding everyone of the values that define the old guard: honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. For Hal, it was proof that even after all these years, his story still mattered. And as he sat there, watching the rest of the parade unfold, he realized something else. The bond between human and horse wasn't just a relic of history. It was timeless, enduring, and alive in every hoofbeat that echoed through the arena. After the emotional high of the parade, the energy in the arena shifted once again as the organizers announced a special cue and a session with Hal. Riders, trainers, and spectators gathered eagerly around the main stage, curious to hear more about his experiences in the old guard. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, creating an intimate setting that encouraged connection and conversation. Hal sat at the center, his posture relaxed but dignified, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Despite the attention focused on him, he exuded calmness, as though he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The first question came from a young boy no older than 12, clutching a notebook and pen tightly in his hands. "Mr. Thompson," the boy began hesitantly, "what does it mean to be part of the old guard?" Hall smiled warmly, leaning forward slightly to make eye contact with the child. "That's a great question," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Being part of the old guard means carrying the weight of history on your shoulders while moving forward with hope in your heart." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "Every step you take, every task you perform, it's not just for yourself. It's for those who came before you and those who will follow. You represent something bigger than any one person." His answer sparked a wave of curiosity among the audience, and soon questions poured in from all directions. A teenage girl raised her hand next, asking, "How did you learn to work so well with horses? Was it hard at first?" Hal chuckled softly, recalling his early days of training. "Oh, it was definitely hard," he admitted. "Horses are incredibly intelligent animals, but they can also be stubborn. Building trust takes time, patience, and consistency. I learned quickly that you can't force a horse to do anything. It has to want to work with you." He went on to explain how communication between rider and horse wasn't always about commands or signals. Sometimes it was about understanding each other's moods, strengths, and limitations. When you truly connect with a horse, it's like having a partner who knows exactly what you need, even before you do. As the session continued, Hal shared practical advice tailored to the young riders in attendance. One aspiring equestrian asked how to stay calm under pressure during competitions. Hal leaned back thoughtfully, tapping his cane against the ground as he formulated his response. "Pressure is inevitable," he said, "but remember this: preparation beats panic every time. Practice until your skills become second nature. And when the moment comes, focus on what you can control: your breathing, your posture, your mindset. Let everything else fade away." His words resonated deeply with the listeners, many of whom nodded in agreement or scribbled notes furiously. Another participant, a seasoned trainer, posed a more philosophical question. "What's the most important lesson you've taken from your time in the old guard?" Hal didn't hesitate. "Respect," he replied firmly. "Respect for others, respect for tradition, and respect for yourself. In the old guard, we didn't just perform ceremonies. We embodied values. Every action, no matter how small, reflected our commitment to excellence and honor. That's something I've carried with me my whole life." By the end of the Q&A, the atmosphere in the arena felt electric. Young riders approached Hal one by one, seeking autographs, photos, or personal advice. Some brought their horses along, hoping Hal might offer tips based on his observations. He obliged graciously, running his hand along a mare's neck or examining a saddle's fit, offering insights that only someone with decades of experience could provide. Each interaction was meaningful, leaving both Hal and the participants inspired. For Hal, the session reinforced something he'd begun to realize throughout the day. His story still mattered. Though he had long since retired from active duty, his experiences held lessons that transcended generations. As he watched the young riders walk away with newfound determination in their eyes, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. These weren't just strangers. They were torchbearers, ready to carry forward the values he had spent a lifetime upholding. And in that moment, Hall understood that his legacy wasn't confined to the past. It was alive, thriving, and growing with every hoofbeat that echoed across the arena. Ask. Explain. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the horse show grounds, the event transitioned into its final phase, a tribute ceremony dedicated to honoring veterans like Hall. The organizers had planned this segment carefully, ensuring it would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Hall was ushered to the front of the arena once again, this time not as a speaker or participant, but as the centerpiece of gratitude and recognition. Though he tried to remain humble, there was no denying the significance of what was about to unfold. The ceremony began with a musical performance by a local choir, their voices rising in harmony as they sang patriotic songs that stirred deep emotions in the crowd. Parents held their children close, some mouthing the lyrics silently while others wiped away tears. As the last note faded into the crisp evening air, the announcer stepped forward, his voice filled with reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "today we have been privileged to host a true American hero among us, Mr. Harold Thompson, a veteran of the Old Guard. His service, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to our nation embody the very best of who we are as a people." Hall stood quietly, his hands clasped in front of him, as the audience erupted into applause yet again. But the tribute didn't stop there. The organizers unveiled a surprise that left even Hall momentarily speechless, a plaque mounted near the entrance of the arena. It gleamed under the fading sunlight, its inscription simple yet powerful, "In honor of those who serve with dignity and grace." Beneath the words was an etching of a soldier standing beside a horse, evoking the timeless partnership between human and animal that defined the Old Guard. Hall walked slowly toward the plaque, accompanied by Sarah, the organizer who had greeted him earlier. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder as they stopped in front of it. "This is for you, Mr. Thompson," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "and for all those who have served alongside you." Hall stared at the plaque, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He ran his fingers lightly over the engraved words, feeling their weight sink into his soul. For so many years, he had carried the memories of his service quietly within him, never seeking recognition. But now, seeing his legacy immortalized in such a meaningful way, he felt a profound sense of validation. After the unveiling, several riders approached Hall, each wanting to express their gratitude personally. One young boy, barely tall enough to see over the fence, handed Hal a small wooden carving of a horse. "I made this for you," the boy said shyly, his cheeks flushed red. Hall knelt down to meet him at eye level, accepting the gift with a smile. "Thank you, son," he replied warmly. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." Nearby, a teenage girl presented Hall with a sketch she had drawn during the day, a detailed portrait of him riding the bay gelding earlier. "You inspired me today," she said earnestly. "I hope I can be as brave and kind as you someday." These moments were punctuated by laughter, hugs, and heartfelt conversations. Hall found himself surrounded by people of all ages, each eager to share how his presence had impacted them. Some spoke of renewed motivation to pursue their dreams. Others expressed a deeper appreciation for history and tradition. Hall listened intently, nodding and offering words of encouragement whenever prompted. Though he had come to the event expecting little more than a quiet afternoon, he realized now that he had given something far greater: inspiration. As the ceremony drew to a close, Hall took one last look around the arena. The flags fluttered gently in the breeze, the horses stood patiently in their stalls, and the crowd lingered, reluctant to let the day end. For Hall, it wasn't just about the accolades or the plaque. It was about connection. He had spent decades serving his country, often without fanfare or acknowledgement. Yet here, surrounded by strangers turned friends, he understood that his story had transcended time and place. It had become part of something larger, woven into the fabric of a community united by shared values. When Hall finally turned to leave, the crowd broke into spontaneous applause once more. Riders tipped their hats, children waved enthusiastically, and adults called out words of thanks. Hall raised a hand in farewell, his heart full and his spirit lifted. As he climbed into his car and drove away, the photo album resting on the passenger seat beside him, he knew this day would stay with him forever. Not because of the tributes or gestures, but because of the reminder that his life's work continued to inspire others. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of his mind, he could almost hear thunder's hoofbeats echoing softly, carrying him forward into the future. As Hall drove home that evening, the fading sunlight painted the countryside in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the winding roads. The quiet hum of his car engine provided a soothing backdrop to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. His hands gripped the steering wheel lightly, still tingling from the day's events. The applause, the speeches, the heartfelt tributes. But more than anything, it was the connections he had made that lingered in his mind. Strangers had become friends, young writers had found inspiration, and for the first time in years, Hal felt truly seen, not just as an old man with faded memories, but as a living testament to values that transcended generations. When he arrived home, Hal parked his car carefully and stepped out into the cool night air. The familiar sights and sounds of his garden greeted him, grounding him in the present moment. Fireflies danced lazily among the flower beds, their soft glow adding a touch of magic to the twilight. Hal walked slowly toward his porch, the photo album tucked securely under one arm, and the wooden horse carving clasped gently in his other hand. He paused for a moment, looking up at the stars scattered across the vast sky. It was a sight he had often admired during his nights on duty at Arlington Cemetery, where silence reigned supreme and the heavens seemed close enough to touch. Inside, Hal placed the plaque he'd been given earlier on his mantelpiece, positioning it so it caught the light streaming through the window. Beneath it, he set the wooden horse carving and the sketch of himself riding the bay gelding. Each item told a story, a piece of the day's journey that he wanted to preserve forever. Then he opened the photo album once again, flipping through its pages until he reached the picture of Thunder. Hal traced the outline of the horse with his finger, smiling softly as memories flooded back. "You'd be proud," he whispered aloud, imagining Thunder standing beside him, ears pricked forward, ready to listen. For the rest of the evening, Hal sat in his favorite armchair, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about the young boy who had carved the wooden horse, the teenage girl who had drawn his portrait, and the countless others who had approached him with gratitude and admiration. Their enthusiasm reminded him of something important. Legacy wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about impact. Every word he had spoken, every lesson he had shared, had planted seeds that would grow over time. Someday those children might pass along his stories, ensuring that the spirit of the old guard lived on. Hal also thought about the plaque outside the arena, its inscription etched not just in metal, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the ceremony. In honor of those who serve with dignity and grace. Those words weren't just for him. They were for every soldier, past and present, who had answered the call of duty. They were for the horses, too, whose strength and loyalty had carried soldiers through unimaginable challenges. And they were for the future, a reminder that honor and respect were timeless virtues worth preserving. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Hal finally rose from his chair and turned off the lights. Before heading to bed, he glanced one last time at the items on his mantelpiece, now bathed in moonlight. They weren't just mementos. They were symbols of hope, connection, and continuity. Tomorrow would bring another day, another chance to tend to his garden, share his stories, and inspire those around him. For Hal, this wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new one. Lying in bed, Hal closed his eyes, feeling a deep sense of peace. In the quiet darkness, he could almost hear the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the distant echo of a bugle playing taps. Thunder was there with him, as steadfast and loyal as ever, watching over him like a guardian angel. Hal smiled faintly, knowing that his story, his legacy, was safe in the hands of those who cared. As sleep claimed him, he drifted off with a single thought in his heart. The ride never truly ends. It carries on, passed from one generation to the next, forever etched in the hoofprints left behind.